So with us tonight is Dr. Ted Cable, Professor of Park Management and Conservation at Kansas State University, and Grand Poobah of the art of interpretation, how to communicate a message to a broad, how would you define interpretation? I'll let you define it. Okay. So he's going to define interpretation. And also author of numerous books, including The Gifts of Interpretation. And we have some of his other books here, in case you're interested in perusing them and perhaps purchasing them for your personal library. One of his favorite things to do is to take boring drives and make them exciting enough to put them into a book. This is his latest. The Driving Across Missouri, a Guide to I-70. Well, once you hit the Missouri-Kansas border, you can put this one aside and take the Driving Across Kansas Guide to I-70. He's just going to keep going, right?
Well, we have to Illinois.
Oh, okay, but I'm going to when you turn around and go back through Missouri.
Go to Chicago.
There you go. Guide to traveling through Illinois, I-55. Okay, so you got to get off I-70 on I-55.
Oh man, that's hard.
And then along the way, you're driving with binoculars. It's like walking with binoculars. You can identify the birds. Birding at 70 miles an hour is another art form. And all his books are available for sale if you are interested in purchasing them, and he will kindly autograph them so you can sell them on eBay for a higher price. So, without further ado, our distinguished guest, Dr. Ted Cable.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with you. You know, I was scheduled a few weeks ago on a Saturday, and then this happened, which involved surgery. So I appreciate you working into your schedule, and particularly on a weekday night. And especially a beautiful night. It's nice for you guys to come out. So yeah, so this first PowerPoint that we're going to present is on the topic of interpreting interpretation. We're going to talk about what is interpretation and what isn't interpretation, and then just present just a few principles of how you go about doing interpretation. And then we'll take a break and do something else after the break. So, the earliest, interpretation is kind of a funny word, for what we do. And a lot of people don't understand, and I'm not even sure my parents know what I do exactly when I say I'm an interpreter. It's like French to Spanish or English, or that's how you usually think of, right? And in fact, in one of the books, I paraphrased Winston Churchill, who said about democracy, about the word democracy, he said it's the worst of all possible words except all the others. And that's sort of how I feel about interpretation, It's, we just have wrestled as a profession, and I can tell you all kinds of funny stories about ideas people have come up with as we struggle with what to call ourselves. But interpretation is not a bad word, as I think you'll see, but it is a confusing word a lot of times. And the earliest use of the word interpret, the way we are going to talk about it, that I could find, were by these two gentlemen, John Muir. Many of you, I imagine, are familiar with John Muir, a 19th century naturalist, right? Very involved in the formation of Yosemite and so forth. And he wrote, "I will interpret the rocks through the language of the flood, storm, and avalanche." He's interpreting those things. And then he'll acquaint himself with glaciers and wild gardens and get as close to the earth as I can. And then this guy, Enos Mills, you may not have heard of him. He was a Kansas boy from Fort Scott. He ran away from home at about the age of 14, went out to what's now Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park, which of course wasn't Rocky Mountain National Park in those days, but he was instrumental in creating Rocky Mountain National Park. And he was, in some ways, many people consider him sort of the father of the profession of interpretation. He started leading people up Long's Peak in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, and he wrote about it. He wrote Adventures of a Nature Guide and books like that. And he used the word interpretation, or interpreter, as we do. You can see the aim is to illuminate and reveal an alluring world outdoors. A nature guide, or an interpreter, is an interpreter of geology, botany, zoology, and natural history. And that was what how Enos Mills said. So those are sort of the two sort of seminal uses of the word in the literature. And then our National Park Service, of which Enos Mills was pretty influential in getting that established as well. Really, it was the Park Service that has adopted this term interpretation over all these years, and then over time other agencies have adopted it as well. When I first started in the field, my first job, I was called a park naturalist. I didn't know what an interpreter was, but I guess I was one, looking back at it. But so you see, it's just kind of a funny term in that way. But you see that literally, you can interpret the rocks. And in the case of you folks, you're an interpreter of the prairie, right? You're going to interpret the prairie just like it's a foreign language. The prairie is foreign to most of the people that come to you, and you're going to interpret it just as if you were interpreting the language. So, and I'll try not to make this too booky, but a guy named Freeman Tilden came along in the 1950s, and this was sort of the interpretation Bible, this book called Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden. You can see there, I won't read it to you off the screen, but you can see that that's his formal definition of interpretation. And even today, if you go out and apply for a job in interpretation with Missouri State Parks or Arkansas State Parks or some other agencies like that that are very professional, it's very likely that during the job interview they'll say, do you know Tilden's definition of interpretation? I mean, it's expected to be known. This is sort of stuff that professional interpreters know, and I ask my students to memorize, for example. So it's an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships. And then you can see how he does this. Freeman Tilden, interestingly enough, was not a naturalist. He was a Broadway playwright and a journalist in New York City. Somehow he had linked up with the National Park Service and the Park Service. So he was really a communicator, right? A playwright and journalist. He linked up with the Park Service back in the 1950s, and they sent him around all national parks throughout our country, and he thought about and wrote about the interpretive services that were being presented in our national parks back in the 50s, you know, in places like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon and Gettysburg, places like that. And so he came up with some principles of interpretation based on his experience as an expert communicator. And again, this sort of became the Bible of the profession. That date is very misleading. You know how publishers will just come out with a new edition and change something very minor just so they can sell more books? You know, maybe you've experienced that. This was really written in the 1950s, but the publisher, the third edition was 1977, but essentially it was essentially the same thing. They messed with some pictures or something. So that's really from the 1950s. Even to this day, it's one of the sort of required readings in our field. Now this is a much more succinct definition. I'm only going to give you two. I won't teach you what the definitions tonight. But I think it is important to sort of lay the groundwork about what interpretation really is and what it isn't. And so our professional association, National Association for Interpretation, says it's a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. Just think about that for a moment. In your role as docents here at Konza, is that what you do, or can you envision yourself doing that? Forging emotional and intellectual connections with, between the visitor, the person that's out on your hike on the trail, for example, and the prairie. Making emotional connections. We'll say a little bit more about that later and how we might do that. The other thing that I think is kind of important, and it was added much more recently to this definition, is the mission-based. Interpretation should be purposeful. It should have a purpose. Sometimes we dismissively talk about some interpretive programs as the pet the bunny programs, you know, where you just pet the bunny, oh, isn't that fun, that's nice, and you go on your way, right? Maybe it's sort of lacking a purpose, but interpretation is powerful, and I hope I can impress upon you tonight how powerful interpretation is. And so it should be used correctly, because there's also things like interpropaganda that we talk about. And I hope that it's used purposefully, you know, with the mission of, in this case, Konza Prairie in mind. Okay, so those are two formal definitions. So, just to sort of digest all that, and you'll have those, I guess, on your handout, so that's nice, you don't have to worry about writing all that stuff down. But I guess the way I would like to sort of blend those is to impress upon you the idea that interpreters are meaning makers. You convey a personal meaning to your audiences. And also, and if you remember, these are the key words that came from those other two definitions you've just seen. Freeman Tilden used the word revelation. You're a revealer. You're helping people see something that they otherwise would not have seen. You're revealing it, like voila, right? Voila, here's a grasshopper or something, you know. So you're helping people, and I love that picture. That's a friend of mine over in Missouri who's an interpreter. I don't know what exactly he was doing there, but to me that's so indicative of what an interpreter does. You help people see things in the prairie. You reveal things to them. Maybe it's not necessarily a visual thing. Maybe you reveal a truth to them that they otherwise would not have known. So I love the thought that we're revealers and we're meaning makers. We're also memory makers and lots of other things too. So now somebody has written that your guests here at Konza and at other places will remember 10% of what they read, 30% of what they hear, 90% of what they do. But most of all, people that come to Konza that you interact with, what they'll remember the longest is how you made them feel. Okay, so you notice I've already used the word emotion in a couple of these slides. I know sometimes, especially in my degrees are in biology too, so I can talk about biology as a biologist. Sometimes, at least when I was going through the ranks, emotions were always kind of thought of as something that was real kind of fuzzy and nebulous, and real biologists didn't want to think about them. I don't think very much. They're very clinical, you know. In fact, I've heard so many times resource managers say, the people are just acting emotionally, as if that's like an unusual thing. I mean, they're human beings, right? And so one of the things I'm going to stress tonight is the importance of feelings and the importance of emotions in learning. And frankly, Freeman Tilden said this, and I agree, that emotions are superior to facts. Now that you may have a sort of a knee-jerk reaction against that. I'm not against facts. You know, facts are good. But emotions are superior to facts. And as we go through tonight, I'll try to illustrate why that's true, I believe. Okay, so, but with this in mind then, another passage, sort of somewhat definitional, but with this business of having to do stuff and to participate, be participatory, people really want to learn and remember, it's an educational and recreational activity that conducted in informal settings such as parks, historic sites, museums, zoos. And again, then it gets back to the personal meaning assigned to the resources in an entertaining manner. That, again, you might not think of yourself as entertainers or performers, but if you're going to reach out to people, and if people are going to stay tuned to you and hang with you and pay attention to you, if you're going to hold their attention, it has to be enriching and it has to be entertaining. That doesn't mean you have to be like a comedian or anything, right? But you have to be holding their attention. You're a performer. You're performing, and they're an audience, right? And so the this is the process. I know, that's so let me just go back. Let's see. Let's go backwards. Yeah, okay. Let me just say, so we've made up a word that encompasses this, and it's called edutainment. And again, some people hate that. I mean, I'll just throw that out there. You take it or leave it. But in a sense, you're sort of in the edutainment arena, right? As are most museums and zoos and things. It's fun. It's got to be fun because they're their leisure time, right? It's not a course. They don't have to be there. The people that come on your hike aren't going to be graded. They could leave at any time. And so you have to draw them out. And if you're giving a boring lecture on geology or something, they're not going to come. Or if they come once, they're not going to come back, and word will spread about that. So it does have to be sort of edutainment. Okay, now on to this equation that I'm so proud of, because it makes me feel like a real scientist. We have to have an equation. I feel smart just talking about this. And if only I had a white lab coat and if I had a British accent, then I'd feel real smart. But I don't. But so yeah. This is our fancy equation. It's the only equation we got in the whole field. But this is sort of this equation, but really it's a metaphor. You might think of it as. It explains the process of interpretation. And so remember from math class, you do what's in the parentheses first, right? So K sub R is knowledge of the resource, and that's what you guys are getting through all this docent training here. You're getting knowledge of the resource. I mean, I even overheard some conversations before we started, and you're learning your birds and you're learning your plants, right? And that's great. That's necessary. What I would encourage, though, is that you go even beyond the names of things and the processes and learn what I would call, I guess, the compelling stories of the site. Compelling stories. And we're going to talk about storytelling in a little bit, and that's why I would just want to interject that now. So yeah, know the facts, know the names, but know the stories, the compelling stories of the tall grass prairie. Whatever those might be, and every site has stories. You just have to look for them, find them, and do some research to pull those out. Maybe you're already learning them. Then you have knowledge of the audience. It's so critical to know who you're talking to if you're going to communicate effectively, right? I mean, obviously, you don't see the same commercials on MTV that you would see on the History Channel, right? I mean, when millions of dollars are at stake by advertisers and marketing professionals, they target their messages to target audiences. So we should do the same. And again, this is all sort of a precursor to some of these principles. We'll talk more about this. But here too, I would say, when you see knowledge of audience, what a lot of people think right off the bat is, okay, are they going to be kids? Are they going to be old people? Is it a school group? You know, whatever, that kind of thing. And that's good. Demographics are good. It's really important to know if they're local or if they're transient, so that you can know which examples you can use that will touch them. But when situations allow, what's really wonderful to know is not just, again, the facts about who these people are, but a little bit deeper. Like, what are their motivations? Why did they come? What are they looking for? What motivated them to come to your hike or to your campfire talk or whatever it happened to be? And know what levels of satisfaction they're looking for and so forth. So sort of a deeper knowledge of the audience. Okay, so after you know all about the resource, you know, and you got some great stories to tell, and then you know about your audience, the people you're going to be talking to, so you have a good feeling for that. You put that together, and now this may not be quite as salient for this group here, but it might be. Then you get to AT, which is appropriate technology. But maybe in other venues, if you just sort of think along with me here, at a nature center or something, at this point you would say, okay, this is, given this and this, should we make a brochure? Should we build a nature trail? Should we do a video? Should we best cover this in a hike or a campfire program? I mean, how would be the best way, which medium would be the best way of interpreting this to audiences? Here, I'm not sure of all the interpreters. I know you guys take people out on the trail, right? That's one of them. Is there anything else that you would do as docents? Do you do campfire programs or anything? I don't know enough about you. Conceivably, you might, or
Yeah,
you know,
you would.
so that would be your medium, say a hike, a nature hike, right? And then you have that. And then you get interpretive opportunity. And you notice this doesn't guarantee interpretation, because if it's not done well, it'll fail. And I'd be the first to admit there's a lot of terrible interpretation out there in the world today. Most of it is probably, frankly, and we could talk more about that later, I guess, if you want me to elaborate on what's so bad about most of the interpretation. But it just presents interpretive opportunities if you do all this other stuff well. Because one of the things I like to remind people is that we don't inflict interpretation on people. Okay? So I used to live in a historic town in Indiana when I was at Purdue University. And in fact, the town was called Battleground, Indiana. It was right near Purdue University. And I used to walk over to the battlefield, and I'm a bird watcher, as some of you already know, and I would just want to look at birds. Or sometimes I just want to walk my dog. And I didn't want to talk to a soldier from 1812, you know? But it was always very awkward, because they wanted to interpret 1812, they wanted to interpret the battle. They were inflicting interpretation on me when I wanted to just look at birds, you know? So that's that. So that provides an opportunity, but we don't inflict, and maybe somebody wants to just take a nice contemplative walk on the trail here, right? And maybe they don't necessarily want an all-knowing naturalist, you know, tagging along and trying to enrich their lives. So that's our equation. So now this is this book, Principles of Interpretation. It was meant to really update, I guess, and bring Tilden's book into the 21st century, you might say. And so Larry Beck is at San Diego State University, and myself, we came up with 15 principles. Tilden had 6, and our first 6 are very similar to Tilden's. But again, his book was written in the 1950s, and it just, I think we felt like we could use a little spicing up. And so now this is a pretty widely used text that's been translated into several other languages and so forth. And so it's pretty, these principles are pretty widely adopted, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And we put, these are principles, but we wanted to articulate the principles as gifts that we give. So So the first one is, to spark an interest, interpreters must relate the subject to the lives of the visitors. And so that's the gift of relevancy. And you'll see that if you flip through the book or whatever. So we have principles, but they're articulated forms of gifts that we give our audiences. So that's the very first principle, is that you have to relate the subject to the audience. You have to know what their interests are and then touch those. You have to light that spark in their mind. And if we had more time, we could talk more about the brain and how that happens with cognitive maps, but we need to trigger previously existing maps in their mind, and so they say, oh yeah, I get that, oh yeah, that's like that, you know, and they can make these connections. Remember, we're supposed to be making connections as we make meaning, so we can help them do that. But we have to relate the subject to the lives of the visitors. There's nothing worse, I think, and I've seen this happen right here in Manhattan. And it's been a while, so it was back in the days of carousels. Remember slide carousels, right? Nothing wrong with them. But I still have a few too, more than a few. I wish somebody would, tell me would come up with another use for them or something. But I know of times right here in Manhattan where a canned interpretive program, a slide reel, was taken to Marlette Elementary School in the morning and then taken to Meadowlark Hills in the evening. And the same spiel was given. It was a script, and there was a slide reel, and it was a canned program, and they gave the same program to the kids that they gave to the seniors. And that stuff happens all the time, unfortunately. And it just, obviously, it's common sense, and like I say, just look at the advertising world, right, or anybody else that's serious about communication. They would never do something like that, right? They would always want to target their audiences. They would want to, how do you relate this subject to the lives of seniors? How would you relate the subject to the lives of travelers on I-70? How would you relate whatever it is you're talking about to children? So yes, that's what we endeavor to do. And just to show you how critical it is, just a quick story of a guy that was at the fort that's in St. Augustine, Florida. Some of you may have been there. It's the historic fort, the Spanish fort. And there was a guy that was just kind of tagging along or drug along or something on an interpretive walk there. Not really into the talk at all, from all outward appearances, and just kind of looking around and kind of acting bored and everything. And then the interpreter started talking about the special bricks in the wall of the fort, how they were made out of seashells or something. I think is the way the story goes. And they're very special, the way the Spaniards built this. All of a sudden, the guy pipes up, gets engaged, starts contributing some information that he knows about that. Turns out he's like a bricklayer, mason, or whatever. And he gets all excited about the whole deal. And then, the story, sort of the happily ever after, he becomes head of the friends group and whatever, the whole thing. But the point is, we finally touched something in their mind. We lit that spark, that something he could relate to. He couldn't relate to the cannons maybe, or the uniforms or something, but when he talked about the walls, all of a sudden, wow, the walls, and he really got into that. And so that's our first principle of interpretation, is to try to make an effort to relate to our audiences. And of course, the only way we can, the best way we can do that is with that case of A, right? We need to know something about our audiences, then we can do a better job of relating to them. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go way off in this tangent, but you might be wondering about, what happens if you have families of different ages, and some transient, some not, and all that. One of the things we try to do then, if it's a real mixed group, if it's not homogeneous, is we try to interject what we refer to as universals, something that anybody from any culture, at any age, can appreciate. Concepts such like home, freedom, courage, resiliency, things like that, themes that everyone sort of gets, right? Family, community. And if we can build our interpretation around these universals, then there's a likelihood that maybe everybody can relate to those. Okay, moving right along. Here's number 2, and we're only going to do about 6 of these. The purpose of interpretation goes beyond providing information to reveal deeper meaning and truth. And I think this is more true today than it's ever been true, but 100 years ago almost, actually, now that I think about it, about 100 years ago, Enos Mills again, who was doing this at Long's Peak in Colorado, said the chief errors of a nature guide, remember he was talking about nature guides, are likely to be made by a guide or to become too booky to compel, like the school teacher, the learning of lessons, there's been altogether too much of this dulling lesson business. And that was 100 years ago, and I think it's even worse today. Because, frankly, if you're going to be a park ranger, or an interpreter, docent, or whatever, and if your only role is to be disseminating information, the world probably doesn't need you, or at least not in that role, doing that. We have too much information, don't we? That's my problem. I have so much information, it's a burden. You know, we live in this information age. I liken my situation with information to like an eating disorder, you know? People are always giving me nature magazines and bird books to read and stuff, and they're saying, oh, Ted, did you read this? Did you read this? And they're loaning me books, you know, they're real kind, good, generous, you know, and I don't say no, I don't want to. And so I get all these books and magazines stacking up in my bedstand, and I can't read them all. And then I purge myself, you know, just like the eating disorder, you know. And then I start building them up again, you know. My problem is I have too much information. You know, a person could go online right now, any one of us, and let's just say the Grand Canyon, or we could say Konza for that matter. But we could go online and we could find out every fact that there is to know about the Grand Canyon, how deep it is, how wide it is, how old it is, all the different rock layers. We could find out all the trees that grow there. We could find out all the birds that live there. We could probably see live webcams of various places in real time. We could read journals from some of the tourists that hiked down the canyon yesterday. I mean, there's not a bit of information that we couldn't get about the Grand Canyon that we couldn't get sitting in our dens or living rooms right here in Manhattan, Kansas. You don't need an interpreter. If that's all the interpreter is going to do at the Grand Canyon, stand there and say, the Grand Canyon is this wide and this old and this deep. If they're just throwing out facts, they're not necessary. What do we need? We need interpreters that, to go back to some of those definitions, and in this particular principle, we need someone to reveal deeper meanings and truth. We need someone to help people make that connection. And so some of the trainings I've done, and think about this with here at Konza, as you become docents here. Maybe you'll want to do something like this. We've actually had t-shirts made up that say, so what, on the t-shirt. And that's a reminder to us that as an interpreter, our job isn't just to go out there and say, this is big blue stem, or this is a bur oak, or this is a meadowlark. Our job is to answer that. I mean, people can find that out about us, but our most important job is to answer that question, so what? Why should I care that that's a bur oak, right? Who cares? What does it have to do with me? You know, how can, and these principles are overlapping too, as you'll see as we go through a few of them. You know, how can I relate to a bur oak? You know, what is that? So what? You know, and so that's, to me, that's the real role, and it's not a burden though; it's a privilege, and it's really a cool thing to be able to answer that so what question and get people excited about it. Really, really, that's how that happens, or you know, and that's why I can do such and such, or you know, to get them to be able to relate to something and to see that light bulb go on. And to reveal a deeper meaning of the so what question is really something that's really very rewarding. It's a very rewarding part of interpretation that goes beyond just naming things and labeling things. And you know, I know there's a place for labels, and we have labels in virtually all the parks I've worked at, botanical gardens and things. Naming, that's fine, but that alone is not interpretation. Now there's a place for information dissemination, and maybe giving out some facts about things. But by the definitions that you just saw, right, in terms of revelation, meaning making, making emotional connections with the resource, labels alone are not interpretation. They're just information. So the way Tilden talked about this is he said interpretation is not information. Okay? It's not just getting out information. He said, but information is the raw material of interpretation. Okay? So again, you know, you have to have some information there, right? Otherwise, it's sort of the pet the bunny stuff, you know, that we talk about as our little cliche. Information's good. You want to have some information, obviously, in there. But the error that most interpreters make, and I'm talking about interpreters with the national parks. I'm talking about interpreters with the Smithsonian, especially, and some of these big world-class museums, is that they try to give out far too much information. You know, in the Smithsonian, and this study included other big museums, there was a study done of people, how they interact with the exhibits. And they found, they took randomly sampled, selected exhibits and then studied them. Only about 1% of the visitors actually read the entire text of an exhibit. 1%. Now get this, it gets even better. Of that 1%, 90% were already experts in the field, and they were reading it just to check the facts, to see if they agreed. So now you're down to 1/10 of 1% of the people actually reading that stuff. Why? Because it's too much. And again, we'll see this, a lot of this stuff will be coming up again. They'll be reinforcing threads throughout this. But when we try to show people everything, we show them nothing. Okay, and we'll get to another principle that relates to that. Okay, the third principle is that interpretation as presentation is a work of art. It should be designed as a story. And so stories are, studies have shown that stories are really a powerful way of communicating. If you think about it, it's a natural way of communication. You know, even before the meeting tonight, people were telling stories about various things. We were naturally storytellers. We weren't giving each other lectures, right? No. But we were telling stories about things. Stories about several of us have had similar accidents. We were swapping stories about our experiences and things. The greatest teachers throughout civilization, you know, have been storytellers. The great philosophers told parables, you know, biblical parables. They're stories that teach. I suspect that if you attend a church or a church service or whatever, or if you're just a politician, any sort of public speaker, graduation speeches, that's a timely example, I suppose. When you leave there, if you remember anything at all, it's probably, if there was a good story that was told, you'll remember that story. You may even repeat it over lunch or something, say, man, I heard a good one, or maybe a funny story, a joke, and you even adopt it as your own, and you repeat it because it's a good story. You probably don't remember all the rest of the filler around the story, but we take away the story. And so interpreters are storytellers. And so I hope that as you go out onto the trails here, that you'll tell stories about the grasses and about maybe the relationships between certain grasses and certain critters, or maybe the soil and the grasses or whatever. But find stories. Of course, there's a history here, obviously, too, a human history, and that's just loaded with stories that you can tell. And you'll just, I think you'll find the audience more attuned to you, and they'll remember what you're talking about longer. Stories really do help us remember facts and things that we want to convey. So I know the retention on lectures is very, very low, and with college students. But again, by putting it in the form of a story. And then the other thing that this principle talks about, if you read the whole chapter, is the business about it being an art. And it's an art. It's a performing art, just like music, just like painting. And in a class like this, or if you took interpretation there at the university or whatever, that's just like a piano class or guitar class. You're learning some notes, you're learning some scales, you're learning some chords, you're getting these few principles, you know, the basics down, and so maybe you can be a competent guitarist or pianist or interpreter or artist. And just like that, then it grows, and people have different affinities and different abilities to develop their own style, their own artistic presentation of interpretation. I suspect some of you right now could go out on the trail and lead an amazing hike and just like totally blow me out of the water. One reason why I don't know the resources as well as you guys do, but you know, you can become a virtuoso. Many of my students have gone on to surpass my abilities, and they just become, you know, again, sort of virtuosos of interpretation. They're artists. They have their own style, their own charisma, you know, and so it is an art. You know, it's not really a science in the sense that it's we have general principles of good technique, just like you would with painting or music, but there's a real art component to this. And so, as in any kind of art too, then what another implication of that is, hopefully you're not going to be the best you can be on the first hike that you lead, right? But with practice, just like if you're practicing the piano, you'll get better, and you'll hone your technique, and you'll add some new improv stuff maybe, and it'll become your own, you know. And I think it's really, you know, in a perfect world, and where you actually take this seriously, you know, each one of you, I hope this will be the case, each one of you will make that trail your own, you know, and interpret it in a way that no one else will do, because it's you, you know, and you're an artist, and you have, I don't know if you're compelled to cover certain stuff, I don't know, I don't know what kind of, that's good, you know, I would hope not. That's so liberating for you, you know. So whatever excites you, and whatever you can be passionate about, as an artist, really, take people out there, just wow, you know, and just like an athlete or like a performer on Broadway or whatever, it really is an art. So, and you will get better with practice, just like you would with a musical instrument or with a paintbrush. So that's some of the stuff around principle number 3 that we talked about. Principle 4, the chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. Here again, I'm trying to sort of minimize the whole spewing out of fact stuff, right? Now, information's not bad, you know, instruction's not a bad thing, and there's a place for it in the classroom, you know, and in environmental ed. I don't want to get into a whole bunch of semantics tonight, but environmental education has a more of a formal ring to it. It's a little different than interpretation. Often in environmental ed, there's assessment and there's an actual curriculum and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine, that's good. But interpretation, we're a little bit more free and liberated from that stuff. And so this 4th principle, you know, which I refer to as the provocation principle, or in terms of gifts, the gift of provocation, is that it gets back to this purposefulness. We should leave the people provoked to do something, to think about something differently, to look for something. When you leave my hike tonight, I hope that you'll look up at the stars and think about something, right? I mean, leave them with something to do, something different to think about, something different to notice. Maybe when they get home, when you get home and you look in your backyard, I hope you'll see, you know, provoke something, cause change. And it can provoke stewardship, which is that's definitely part of the Konza mission, I'm sure. Sometimes it's used for public support. You get a little dangerous there because there's propaganda where it's, you know, you're communicating things maybe that are not necessarily unbiased. But you can generate public support, inspiration, personal enrichment. You can provoke all of these things. Now, I've had cynical people say, oh, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Right? You've all heard that cliche, right? Everybody heard that? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? So you can try to provoke them to be good stewards or to have rain gardens or to whatever, you know, not to overgraze the prairie or whatever, but, you know, you can't make them drink. So, but the way I like to think about that is I've added a little piece to that cliche. And so, I agree that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Okay? But you can make the horse thirsty. And that's what our job is to make the horse thirsty. Make them want this stuff, you know. Get them engaged, you know, light the sparks, find some personal meaning in it, and then they'll want to do it, right? The point is, no, you're not going to hold a gun to their head and force them to do anything. We're not going to achieve success or provoke anything that way. But by giving them the desire to make them thirsty for more information. See, that's the other reason why I don't worry too much about fact stuff, is because if we can build these emotional connections between the resource and the person, they'll go out and find all the facts on their own. You know, they'll go home, they'll buy field guides, they'll do whatever, right? Once we light that spark, that'll happen. We don't even have to do that. In fact, if we try to do that, we might stamp out any sort of emotional connection. We don't want to do that. All right, the 5th, and I said we're only going to do 7 of these, I guess 6 plus 1 kind of thing. So we're on number 5 now, the 5th interpretation, principle of interpretation. And again, in that book, there's of course a whole chapter about each of these, but I want to be a steward of your time tonight. Interpretation should present a complete theme and address the whole person. And that's really 2 principles. We did it that way because that's the way Tilden did it. We wanted to have it sort of parallel. So the addressing the whole person part we'll talk about after the break in a different presentation. Let's complete a whole theme. Here's what we mean by thematic interpretation. So let me back up and say why this is important and why it's important to have themes. People can only remember about, scientists have studied this, and we can only remember about 7 plus or minus 2 things in our short-term memory. 7 plus or minus 2, that's the way it's presented in literature. So 5 to 9, right? And that's, at least for me anymore, at my age or whatever, that's on a good day, 5 things. So if I go to the grocery store and I'm supposed to pick up tuna, butter, and milk, 3 things, I might be able to remember that maybe. Tuna, butter, milk, right? But what do we do if it gets up to be about 5 or 6 or 7 things that we're supposed to pick up at the store? We write it down. We write it down. I was told, I heard this said in a presentation once, a professional presentation, that this is the reason why our phone numbers are 7-digit numbers. This, by the way, this research goes back to a guy named George Miller in the early 1950s, around 1950. George Miller, a psychologist, came up with this 7 plus or minus 2. And that our phone numbers were 7 digits with the understanding that that would be within the realm of the short-term memory of people. And I'm old enough to remember when even the beginning of our phone numbers weren't even digits, they were a name, right? Remember that? Yeah. Ours was Garden 4, blah, 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 And so, yeah, I have the opportunity to teach in France on a pretty regular basis, and their phone numbers are 10 digits. Maybe some of you have traveled there and you'll recall this. They're 10 digits, but the way they write them is as 5 2-digit numbers. So a telephone number in France is like 22, 69, 71, 50, 40 or something. They're 5 2-digit numbers. So with all that in mind, the fact that we're only going to remember a few things, right? Isn't it stupid, silly, something, for us to go out and do a hike on the 20 trees of Kansas, or the 20 grasses of Kansas, or 30 birds of Kansas, or something, right? I mean, that's just, they're not going to remember that. So, so the alternative then is, and this is hard. I mean, there's workshops just devoted to theme writing, but the alternative is to come up with a theme for your hike or program, and you can have big themes like for the whole property, like the whole Konza. You're going to say, okay, we're going to have these 3 themes that we're going to explore here. And those are the big ideas. And it's hard to come to grips with this, though, to decide what is the one thing, narrow it down to what's the one thing I want people to remember when they leave here, or when they finish my hike. Is there one concept that I want them to have in their head when they leave here? What's the big idea? So we even write out these theme statements, and we'll write it that way as a complete sentence. Upon leaving my hike, or my campfire talk, or whatever, I want my audience to understand blank. Then, because people can remember a few things, maybe we could have 4 sub-themes. So maybe, I don't know, just off the top of my head, maybe what you want people to know is that soil affects your daily life. Something like that. I don't know, that's just off the top of my head. We can think of better things probably, but something like that, okay? Or we're losing our soil and it's hurting your pocketbook. Something like that. Okay, that's one big idea that relates to them, that has meaning to them, right? All these good things. And then maybe we can have 4 sub-themes. So maybe what we would do is have 4 causes of soil erosion, or 4 things you can do to protect soil on your property, or something like that. You see what I'm getting at? So you'd have one big major theme, and then maybe 4 or 5 chunks of information that you can communicate to the people. And if you communicate that well, and if they go home with those 5 things in mind, we would call that a success. And we believe, most of us would believe, that that's probably achieved more than just walking on a random nature walk. And there's a lot of that too, and I used to lead these too, and I've designed trails like this too, where here's a rotting log, here's a piece of limestone, here's a big blue stem, here's a bluebird. And it's just like random facts, right? A little nature walk. But if you could somehow tie that together thematically, I'm not saying any of those things are bad things to point out, but if you could somehow link that, instead of just having random information, to one coherent theme that you want people to take home, that take-home message, you'll be much more effective. So, I mean, this one, again, some are better than others, but nature's recycling center, the compost pile. So the theme of that is that your compost pile is nature's recycling center. Okay, it's like a recycling center. Okay, and then that's done in this particular exhibit. This is how can you have a richer experience here relates to this whole person stuff, which we'll talk about after the break. So a professor at the University of Idaho, and I was talking to somebody, you were from Idaho, right? Yeah. He's there with that forestry unit we were talking about, Dr. Sam Ham. He just retired from there just this year.
That's a really neat parent to name their child Sam.
I know, isn't that weird? And his middle name's Houston. It's Sam Houston Ham. So he's obviously a Texan. Sam H. Ham. I know, green eggs and, right, or something. But he's famous for saying this, and he's developed a lot of research on this too. People forget facts, but remember themes. And I just took pictures of these, like, you know, do you think anybody looks at this? I mean, you can understand somebody had a cool collection of patches or something. I mean, I understand, I get it, but as a communication, there's just too much, right? You've all seen that, right? Have you seen those brochure racks in hotel lobbies, right? Just have so many brochures, it's like, so you don't pick up any of them. Or you just go down the rack and pick up all of them and then don't read them. But there's just too much information for you to deal with, right? So freedom till then you have seen nothing because you have seen everything. And people forget facts, but they do remember themes. And there's like I said, there's research that backs that up. One more little theme story, I guess. That will help impress this upon you too. So there was another scientist who did a study with a story. And in the story, there was one version that had the theme mentioned right up front, you know. And it doesn't have to be like a high school term paper. You don't have to say the theme of this is, you know. If you make it apparent that, you know, over the next hour, you're going to learn that your life depends on soil or something, right? So you work it in that way. You don't even have to use the word theme. But they identified the theme. One version of the story identified the theme right in the front. A second version identified the theme at the very end. A third version inserted the theme in the middle. And the fourth version had no theme articulated at all in the story. And so then he tested the readers for comprehension of the story and retention of information. And you can probably see where I'm going to go with this, but the theme mentioned first was the best. The theme mentioned at the very end was the second best. The theme in the middle was third. And the one without a theme mentioned at all was fourth. Okay, so that sort of supports this stuff, right? But here's sort of the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. So then what he did, though, he took that story and he didn't jumble the words in a sentence. So he kept, each sentence was a complete sentence and was legible. But he randomly ordered the sentences in the story. So it was just a bunch of hodgepodge of sentences. And the people who read that version scored no worse than the people who read the version with the sentences in the correct order but no thing mentioned. So it really is important that it helps people so much to sort of have a unifying idea of what you're talking about when you're out there on the trail. And I would challenge you to think about themes. I don't know what they are. I'm not sure what the appropriate themes would be here too. It should be mission-based, you know. It should be purposeful. But think about what are the big ideas? What's one big idea that you want people to go home with after they, or kids to go home with, or whoever your audience is when they leave you here at Konza Prairie. It's an interesting thing to think about. We'll talk more about the whole person thing later. Interpretation. This is very similar to the first one. This is our sixth principle of interpretation. That's again articulated in the book. Interpretation for children, teenagers, and seniors when these comprise uniform groups should follow fundamentally different approaches. Okay, so I've already told you about the slide reel that was used with kids and seniors in the same day. And this happens a lot, or the other thing that will happen a lot is people will take basically the same program, but they'll just try to put in smaller words for the kids because they're cognizant of vocabularies. Well, that's a hard word, deciduous. You know, so we won't use deciduous, but everything else is the same. Well, that's not the way kids work. I mean, their brains are totally different. You have to sort of blow up your whole program and have it totally different for children, not just using smaller words, right? And maybe you'd want to have different themes and all sorts of things. So, what are some things you would do differently for children? You guys talk for a second. tell me, what are some things, obvious things maybe that you would do differently with a children's program that you maybe would do with adults? Or what are some specific challenges with kids? Yes.
Like touching, smelling,
Right.
senses and all that.
Hands-on, very active, right. Yeah, very good, yep. What else?
Listen to them.
What's that?
Listen to them.
Yeah, listen to them and give them up, even more so, give them opportunities to talk or sing or do something because they're going to be noisy anyway. So you might as well try to channel that, right, into something productive. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Were you going to say something, Jim, or?
Basically just what
Okay.
she said, but I try to visit with in my head, find out what would you like to know about
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to do,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Appeal to their interests, relate to their, whatever they're interested in. Yeah. Right. Any other thoughts about kids?
Story.
Stories,
Tell a
right.
story.
Stories hold attentions, and they're,
You already said that, but
yeah,
I
that's
can
right.
speak for adults too.
I think adults like them too, but
Yeah.
kids are really attuned to stories because they're used to hearing stories, yeah. That's right. Anything else? Well, they have real short attention spans, so you gotta keep it fast moving. They like to move around, so as you said, have hands on, but have productive moving, so they're gonna move anyway and make it productive. Same thing with the noise. There's all kinds of individual little tricks we can use in terms of elements of surprise and things like that with children. But yeah, you would do things totally differently. Anybody aware of the, what's it called, ecophobia literature? Anybody hear anything about that with children? It's just to illustrate how children are so totally different. People have found that young people have a real dislike of nature, really a distaste of nature. It's icky. Not just city kids, by the way. I know probably right away you're thinking all those city kids know, but not necessarily. But it's icky, it's dirty, it's muddy, it's buggy, it's snaky. There's sort of a disdain, with nature. And so, one of the things that's happening is, for example, in Missouri, Missouri Department of Conservation, they have what they call the Babes in the Woods program, and they take newborns, infants. And that sounds a little weird, but they take babies, just brand new babies, and they have programs, and you go out with the interpreter and the caregiver, the mother, or whatever, and they lay the baby in the leaves or in the grass, let it roll around, let it play, let it get dirty, and they consider it to be an inoculation. They consider it to be a baby shot against the fear of nature. Isn't that interesting? And then they have a program there too in Missouri Department of Conservation from the ages of 2 to 5. It's called Little Acorns. And they take toddlers out and do essentially the same thing. And they play games and they do activities just to get them used to being dirty and leaves and touching things. And that early childhood development is so key in shaping the rest of their lives. And they're taking advantage of that. Now, the other cool thing that you're doing when you do that kind of stuff is you, the interpreter, or you, the docent, you're modeling to the adults what they themselves can do later on their own time with their grandkids or with their kids, right? So you're modeling to the adults and you're actually having an effect maybe on the toddler or on the baby in the woods. So that's one thing, but the other thing is that we've tried, in many cases, tried to appeal to kids to save endangered species, for example. We give them some sort of doom and gloom message. And I was at a conference and I heard some mothers talking, and I had no idea what they were talking about, but they said, they were saying that they don't let their kids watch the last 10 minutes of a nature show. And I thought, oh, they don't like to see the animal get eaten by the cheetah, and torn apart, that's kind of blood and guts. That's what I assumed that they were talking about? No. What they wanted their kid to avoid was the appeal, the doom and gloom appeal at the end of all these shows, like in 20 years there'll be no chimpanzees left, And these kids don't like to hear that, That's a downer for them. And so there's the study's been done, and there's actually guidelines now about talking to children about these environmental problems and at what age is what's appropriate. It's almost like sex education. So if they're a 4th grader, you probably should present it this way. In the zoo world, the American Zoological Association, the ACA, has really formalized this. And so, what if your 4th grader asks about endangered species? Just like sort of the sex education, like at home, But the same sort of issue. What do you tell them? What do you tell them? Well, yes, there are problems like that, but scientists are working to save them. You put a more positive spin on it. Because children can't grasp those relationships and those problems, so then they just want to, get away. It's not fun, right? Nobody likes to hear that. It's sad for them, right? One girl, in the literature they were talking about, the one girl made a big poster and it said, "Save the elephants, buy ivory soap." You know, so they're just too young, and yet, I mean, I've heard of stories, and it's well-meaning, but apparently the science says it's misguided, of having like first graders write letters to congressmen or something, you know. And one of the best quotes, I should have the whole thing, I should put it up here, but I didn't. But the key line in this one quote is that we shouldn't make children to be worriers or warriors. When they're children, they should be playing in mud puddles, playing with ants, doing all those fun things that make an emotional connection with nature. They can fight those battles later. And actually, so if you are doing kids interpretation for young children, getting back to this principle here, what you should do with the youngest of children, maybe up to first, second, third grade in there, is it should just be fun engagement with nature. Just the splashing in the puddles, whatever, that kind of stuff. You're just that. That's good. That's the emotional connections that'll bear fruit later. Then maybe between second, third grade, and sixth grade, those students are really chimed into adventure stuff. So those, you have adventure activities for those kids. Explore, they're a little older, a little bit more mobile, so have exploration. And it's not until they're about teenagers, and mid-teenage years, that they can become sort of social activists. And it'd be appropriate then for them to get involved in some campaign. But by then, if you've done it right, they already have these emotional connections, they love nature, and it's heartfelt, and then they can act on it. But if we start trying to get little kids to write letters to Congress, that's probably not going to work out very well. So that's what I mean when I say children should be totally different. Don't just water down the things that you give to the adults. It should be totally different. All right, teenagers, they're probably our most ignored group. As a profession, I mean, in the big picture, we don't serve teens very well. I think most of us are afraid of teenagers because we know how we were when we were teenagers. And so we have this innate fear of teenagers that we have to overcome. But what do you think some things, what do teenagers like?
Other teenagers.
Other teenagers, absolutely, Jill. So that means you would probably want to do things in social groups, right? You want to have group activities, absolutely. What else might we apply to teenagers in terms of interpretation, based on what we know about them? What else do they like to do? Well, I suppose they do, but I think maybe a more positive way of saying that, I would hope, is that they like to have control, right? I think they do like to have some control. So one of the things we can do then to turn that around to apply it to this is give them responsibilities. Believe it or not, a lot of times we might say, oh, those kids are irresponsible, but they like to be trusted with things, and they like to be given responsibilities, I believe anyway. It shows a level of trust with them and a level of respect for them, and so they like that. Yeah, they like to eat, right? So involve food. They like fashion, a lot of them. So again, Missouri does a great job in interpretation. Missouri, I don't know if they still do this, but for a while they actually had a whole line of clothes for their teenage volunteers. It was called Skunk Works. And like the little Izod alligator, they had like a little skunk, and they had this whole little line of fashion, caps and shirts and stuff that appealed to their teenage volunteers and so forth. So yeah, obviously they like activities, to be active, rappelling and canoeing and physically active sorts of things as well. Seniors, what about seniors? What do we know about seniors? If you knew you were going to have a group of seniors coming, or that you regularly serve seniors, how would you program? What would you program? When would you program? In the morning, absolutely, very good, absolutely, yeah. Seniors are not going to probably go on the 10 o'clock owl hike at your park or whatever, but they'll be up for the 7 o'clock bird walk. They're early to bed, early to rise, right? Teenagers, on the other hand, not so much. They're more likely to come on your 10 o'clock owl hike, but they're probably not going to be up at 7 and come out and look at birds with you. So, yeah, just something as simple as that, scheduling differently, yeah. We know that seniors like to be with other seniors, almost like teenagers. Interesting study showed that, or at least I read this somewhere, that seniors really don't like kids in their programs unless they're their own grandkids. So we're very biased, we're very inconsistent. If it's our grandkid that's fussing or screwing around or something, we can tolerate that, but if it's somebody else's, we old people like me, we have a very low tolerance for that, you know. So they like to be by themselves. Seniors are wonderful volunteers because they have a wealth of knowledge. Seniors have long-term time perspective. Obviously they look a longer time than the others, so they sort of get things about, you know, I mean, the classic tree ring thing means a lot more to a senior than it does to a kid, right? Because you can appreciate years and decades and things. Seniors often love history and they love to share that. Yeah.
I know a lot of my grandparents and uncles and that, they love to share their old stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I can share them with mine as I get older too. So
Right.
The thing is sharing.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. They make that's why they make great volunteers or docents, I think, is that they're great storytellers, you know, and they have great stories to tell. Sometimes it's hard to keep them on track, you know, in terms of which stories they tell. But isn't that the value of stories? I mean, that just reinforces principle number 3. That's what we remember are the stories, right? We might not remember the facts, right? Old Sandham was right. I don't remember any of the facts in my grandpa's stories about exactly how much the fish weighed or whatever, but I remember the story, the general story, right? Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're great storytellers, tremendous resource people, especially if you have a site that has a lot of history on it. That people, you know, they really enjoy that. Seniors do. Of course, there's some physical limitations that we get as we get older, and you need to be aware of that. On the other hand, usually when you're helping seniors in that regard, you're helping everybody, right? I mean, if you use a little bit bigger print on something, that doesn't hurt anybody. Actually, it makes it easier to read for everybody. Gentler slopes are better for everybody because we're trying to communicate along the trail. That trail out there is a trail that teaches. It's a trail that teaches. It's not an exercise trail. I mean, people might get exercise on it, but the purpose is to teach, right? So we don't want people thinking, oh gosh, I'm so tired, you know? I mean, if we want people thinking about the message, about the resource. We don't want them thinking about how tired they are, how hot or whatever. So if you're helping seniors in terms of physical things like that to make their journeys a little easier, really you're helping everybody as far as not getting them a distraction away from your message. So yeah, so you can see how we can apply this particular principle. Okay, the last one is we'll talk about. And you notice I'm only presenting 7. So there's 15 in the book, but I practice what I preach. Wouldn't it be hypocritical of me if I tried to cover all 15 of them and I just told you you only remember 7 things? So anyway, passion. This is our passion principle. It's actually principle 15. It's the last principle of the book, but that's the essential ingredient for powerful and effective interpretation. And whether you're a docent or whether you're a national park ranger or whatever you are, this is the overriding, most important thing, characteristic of a good interpreter is being passionate, being enthusiastic about it. You see John Muir, he said he cares to live only to entice people to look at nature's wonders. And that's his life's mission, you know. And to the extent that you have this passion will really determine how good of an interpreter you're going to be out there on the trail. And it's real easy to pick up, you know. I mean, and it's not because I'm special, I mean, any of you too, you can probably tell within the first minute or two of an interpretive talk whether the person has the passion or not. If they're reading a script, or if they sound bored or something like that, they probably don't have that passion. You know, I can tell you a story about an interpreter who didn't have the passion. He was working at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, and he had memorized his spiel. And it was a spiel to him, right there that tells you he didn't have the passion. But he had memorized it, just wrote memorization. And something happened in the crowd, I don't remember, a baby cried or somebody dropped something or whatever. And he got distracted, he lost his place, and he had to start all over again. That person did not have the passion. I mean, everybody's embarrassed, right? The audience is embarrassed, they're all looking down at their feet, you know? They feel bad for him, he's embarrassed. A big, bad thing all the way around for everybody. But, you know what, if you have the passion for the resource, you're gushing about it, right? You love the people that come to you. It's not just for the resource, but it's for the people who come. You really like the people that are coming out to Konza. You love the prairie. You have this sort of missionary zeal, right? It was like a missionary. You just want to tell people about it. One of the things about interpreters is one of our faults is that the best interpreters don't know when to quit, because they have this passion. So someone once said that asking an interpreter a question is like trying to get a drink out of a fire hose, because we just way too much, overdo it with information. Yeah, trying to get a drink out of a fire hose. So, but it's because we love the prairie, we love people, we think this stuff is so cool. We just can't wait to share it with them. It's not a matter of memorizing stuff, I mean, it's a matter it's in you. It's part of you. It's who you are, really. You do what you do because it's who you are, and in the position that you're at. And so, and you know what? If you have that, it doesn't really matter so much. I mean, hopefully you don't. But if you screw up some of these other principles, or if you mispronounce a word, or if you forget the scientific name of something, or if you make some other mistake, because people, enthusiasm is so contagious that they'll see that you care. And you've probably heard this old adage about school teachers. I think it's usually about, the students don't care what you know, they want to know that you care. People heard that, right? It's the same thing with interpreters and your audiences. You as a docent, the people that come out, they don't really care how much you know. They don't really care if you know every scientific name of every plant along the trail. But what would make a much bigger impression upon them is to see your enthusiasm, your passion, and your connection to those prairie grasses, regardless of their scientific name, and that is what's contagious to them. So, and of course, boredom is contagious too, just like enthusiasm. So if you're bored with something, that spreads like wildfire too. So, yeah. So Emerson said, "Nothing great was ever accomplished without enthusiasm," and there's nothing so contagious as enthusiasm, as this slide says as well. So, you guys, Master Naturalists, Konza docents, you guys have the opportunity through applying these few principles to change lives every day. And that's something to be excited about, enthusiasm. Just think about that. Not everybody gets to do that. But not every job. But you guys, literally, you don't know who's going to show up on your hike someday, some kid. And it probably happens more than you'll ever know. And you'll say something, you'll show them something, and that may shape the rest of their life. That's so cool. Lauren's seeing a minnow or something, I'm going to be interested in fish, and you never know what. I mean, all of us, you're all interested in nature. It started somehow, right? And you could probably, if you think back, you could think of very specific events and very specific people that helped shape the course of your interest in nature. And you have the opportunity of doing that here at Konza, even by the bus stop. So thank you very much. I guess we'll take a break now.